You think this could be fatal for the legislation?
Keir Starmer, having made this an issue he wanted, I think the leadership thing to do is to get a grip of this.
Sometimes you have to sort of hold your nerve in politics.
I think you're not right on that. If you want to lead, lead.
So let's start with the assisted dying bill. And this is a private member's bill. And so, this is not government legislation. But when we've discussed this before, we've agreed that this is probably one of the most consequential things, as you were just saying, that is going to be passed by Parliament in this period. And certainly the government's allowed time for it, so they're not trying to kind of kill the debate off. And the legislation, if you remember, kind of passed at second reading. That's the sort of in principle, do you agree with this legislation? It passed with a reasonable majority, but not, certainly nothing like as big as the majority that the government itself has. So 330 people voted in favour and 275 MPs voted against. But it's now in committee stage, which is when you look at the detail, and then it'll come back to the kind of final vote in the House of Commons, which is called the third reading. Sorry to get all technical with people, but so they understand. There's a kind of key final vote before it leaves the House of Commons. And Kim Leadbeater, the MP who's bringing it in, backbench MP, is proposing a major change to the law. She is saying now that no longer will it be a High Court judge who signs off on a decision by someone to end their life, but instead there will be a panel. We'll come on and talk a bit more about that. And some people are saying now, that could be fatal for the bill. That will swing the kind of people who were, just about in favour, but were happy with the safeguards of having a High Court judge. So that's the sort of backdrop to it all. And I think we should start with Kim Leadbeater explaining why she's made this change.
So the panel would now be a senior legal expert, either a retired judge or a KC, but they would be accompanied by people like a psychiatrist and a social worker, because the two big issues that have come up throughout this whole process as assessing capacity and checking for coercion. Now, psychiatrists and social workers do those things as part of their daily work all the time. So we would have an assisted dying commission, which would be headed by a High Court judge or a retired High Court judge. So you've got the judicial oversight, but you would have these expert panels who would make the decisions once the doctor had made that referral.
First of all, is she making this change because she genuinely thinks this, as she's just saying there, is going to make more safeguards? You're going to have people who are, as she says, experts in spotting coercion, not just lawyers? Or is it because the legal system has said, look, we can't have High Court judges involved? And when we were talking about this before this show, you think this could be fatal for the legislation?
That's right. If you go back to the time of that second reading vote, there were many people who said that the role of High Court judges was vital to give them assurance that they could feel confident in this process. And the combination of the huge burden that would place upon the court, I think it's pretty clear that the message from the judiciary is that they can't deal with this. That will have been the message from the Justice Department. And don't forget, the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, voted against this legislation. But the problem is, the question has always been, is this a slippery slope? If you bring in this change, over time, do you weaken and water down the safeguards? And will that happen in the years to come? And there will be many people who will fear that's happened before the bill has even got to the support stage and the third reading vote. And Kim Leadbeater is trying to say this is a strengthening. I think many people will see it as a weakening. But I think the reality is, look, she's done a really, really good job. But if you go back to the conversation that we had back in November, we said that the only way to succeed and build a consensus and deal with the difficult issues and get the government bound in and really make this work was to say that Kim Leadbeater has done great, but there's only so far she can take this. It's only so far you can take this with a private member's bill, and that actually, if there is a will of Parliament to look at this and the second reading says yes, then you ought to take this out of the private member's bill process. And I have to say, I think it is now likely, if it carries on this track, this bill is going to die. Big question, what's the government going to do? In fact, the bill just got through at second reading, but I think now it is very difficult to see this bill getting through its stages because there is a lot of concern being expressed now about the watering down of the role of the judges. And, that consensus building hasn't happened. There isn't agreement within government about what the right way forward is, let alone in Parliament. But I think the really interesting question now is, what does Keir Starmer do? Because, this is happening because he made a promise to Esther Rantzen. Kim Leadbeater did this because she was top of the ballot for private members' bills, and she was, I think, encouraged to do this. There is obviously divides in the cabinet. There'll be some people in Downing Street thinking, well, look, maybe this will just go away. But I'm not sure that's now a cost-free option for Keir Starmer.
But you can look at the history of kind of important social legislation in our country, like the legalization of homosexuality, the abolition of the death penalty, the legalization of abortion, which are great kind of landmark pieces of social reform. And the vehicle of using the private members' bill was used in all of those cases. The private members' bill stops it being formal government legislation. But the difference, I think, and I'm not, intimately involved in the process, obviously, is that back then it was very clear that the government supported this legislation, that the earlier ones I gave the examples of are Labour governments, but the reduction in the age of consent was the Conservative government, and indeed gay marriage under Cameron, that the government supported these things. And here, it feels like the government's influencing the process. So clearly, Kim Leadbeater is reacting to pressure from the Ministry of Justice. But it's a bit confusing because the Secretary of State for Justice may not just be speaking as the Secretary of State for Justice, but Shabana Mahmood has a personal objection to and moral, if you like, objection to the legislation. And so it's quite muddled. Where is the government on this? And if the government wants it to happen, I think I'd be right in saying, but you may be closer to it than me, if Downing Street signalled it's very important to Keir Starmer this legislation gets through, even if they stick with the method they're using, the private members' bill, I think it would get through. I mean, remember, it did have a reasonable majority at second reading. And so I think if there was a sort of clear signal from Downing Street, yes, I know it's a free vote, but it matters. Certainly, if you voted for it before, don't change your vote.
I think that Keir Starmer did send that signal. He himself has said he was voting for the bill, he wanted the bill. But what he didn't do was get his cabinet into a place where there was a unified cabinet view. It's possible for people to dissent within the cabinet on moral grounds, but that didn't happen. The government hasn't worked out what its view is of whether the legislation can work. It feels to me as though they've ended up rather hiding behind Kim Leadbeater. She's out there now trying to lead this kind of complex attempt to find a bill which would work. But she's not a cabinet minister. She doesn't have a whole government department behind her. And, it was really interesting to me on GMB this week. We had a huge number of people very upset at the idea that this bill was not going to pass. From Esther Rantzen, I'm sure she feels that, but also the very many people who agree with her. And Keir Starmer, having made this an issue he wanted, I think the leadership thing to do is to get a grip of this. There will undoubtedly be people in the cabinet.
When you say get a grip, let's spell out what do you mean by that?
Well, it's not too late to do what we said he should do in November, which is pull the plug on the private members' bill because the government is now going to have a process which will lead to government legislation. He can still do that.
Don't you think that kills things off? The momentum is important in politics and it's important in legislation.
And what is the momentum this week, for or against?
Well, it's still not clear. Remember, as I say, it had a majority of 30-odd at second reading. It's not clear that all of those MPs have switched, because now there isn't the High Court judge being involved, so they're going to vote against the legislation. Sometimes you have to sort of hold your nerve in politics, and having kind of got this far, I think the risk for the campaigners for assisted dying will be the moment we pull it, the moment we agree to let the government take it on now for next year. Who knows where the government's going to be in a year? Who knows what their priorities are going to be? There will be a load of people in Downing Street telling the Prime Minister, look, for God's sake, don't bring back the assisted dying bill. That's the last thing we need right now. We've got all sorts of other challenges. So I think having got this far, okay, so they didn't take, your advice back in the autumn of right at the beginning, do it this, get the government involved. I think having got this far, I would advise them to press on and try and get it over the line and get Starmer. The reason why people didn't really know where the government was in the autumn was because the Health Secretary and the Justice Secretary were the most public voices on the legislation and they were against. So if you had some more public voices in favour from the top of the government, I think you'd get it over the line.
Well, I think you're not right on that. And I think the momentum is ebbing away fast from this legislation. And it is so easy to kill a private member's bill. And if the cabinet is not united and the government is not signed up to a workable reform, and lots of people who went through the second reading vote thinking that the role of the judges was central, and it's now going to be a psychiatrist and a social worker and somebody who's legally qualified. And they'll think, I'm just not sure whether this massive piece of legislation is really and truly fit for purpose. And, I think the most likely thing which kills it for a generation is if the bill just dies. And there'll be people in Downing Street and people in the cabinet saying, we've got more important things to worry about than this, and so be it. But I think there'll be a lot of public anger, and Keir Starmer is seen as the person who said this should happen. So if you want a reform in this space in the next 3 to 5 years, then I think Keir Starmer's got to grip this and the government has got to take ownership.
So there might well be people in Downing Street saying exactly what you're saying. Which is just let it fizzle out, let it get
They'll be
voted
saying, why
down.
did Keir Evans make this promise to restaurants in the first place? Is this really our priority?
So if you're advising Kim Leadbeater, who I think has demonstrated some real courage in leading this legislation, it's not something she campaigned on before. And by the way, for those who don't know, she is actually the sister of the murdered MP Joe Cox. We can play the role of what you do in Downing Street, but if you're her, how do you get the Prime Minister out into the open? How do you drag him out?
Well, I think in the end, the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister, not Kim Leadbeater, and he has to decide to lead rather than to hide behind her. And all she can do, look, does not have a long-standing record of campaigning this area, but they have a ballot for who gets a private member's bill.
Yeah.
She was the top of it, and then I'm sure encouraged by the Labour leadership, she took this up for them. She can see over the next days through the committee, coming back into the report stage, whether there is going to be a majority in Parliament. So she doesn't have to make this decision now. But I think that that the momentum is ebbing away fast. And if that is what's going on, she has to say to Keir Starmer, look, I was doing this for you, but this isn't working. What do you want? And if he wants to let it die, it will die. But actually, that will be a real defeat for him and for this important reform. But you could never get this important reform done in a sort of amateurish way, driven by the campaign groups. I just think it's too hard and too complicated to have done in this way. And I hear what you say about private members' bills in the past, but I think this was too difficult and complex. And the absolute centrepiece of the second reading is that this is going to be decided by judges. And then a few weeks later, it's not.
So the first practical piece of advice is you want a really good whip.
You really
So
do.
she needs to have, either the government can provide a really good whip, or she needs to get someone who's been a whip and count the votes so that she can answer the question you're posing, which is, has she got the votes when it comes to the report stage and the third reading? And if she hasn't, or she thinks it's too close to call, then she might switch to plan B or encourage the government to switch to plan B.
Well, I said back in November that they thought that's what they should have done then.
But
And
push
I
on
don't
whilst
think-
trying to gather the intel on the votes, because, as we know, the first rule of politics is you've got to learn to count.
That is true. Well, we will keep watching this as it develops, and very interesting. But I'd love to be inside the room in number 10, seeing who is urging for this to be supercharged by the government to get it on the statute book in the Parliament, and who's saying, why did we ever end up supporting this in the first place? This is not our priority. Do you know what they'll be saying? They'll be saying we've got to worry about the economy and the NHS and the threat of reform, and that is the important thing.
Yeah, but they told David Cameron that about gay marriage, and he pressed on. And now if you ask David Cameron what are the 4 or 5 things you're proudest of as Prime Minister, he'd say passing that legislation.
But David Cameron didn't hide behind a backbencher.
No. That was
led
government.
it.
That was government legislation.
That's all I'm saying. If you want to lead, lead.